Roger, good copy on position. Understand you're running, taking on water in the stern. Requesting a number of persons on board. Over. Number of persons, 47 people on board. Okay.
The Alaska Ranger, a frozen fish factory trawler, started its life originally as an offshore supply ship. From the U.S. Coast Guard's investigative report, the design and arrangement of the Alaska Ranger was typical of an offshore supply vessel converted to a fish trawler/processor. Now, these supply vessels they're referring to are those you may have seen in my previous videos, supporting the many operations surrounding offshore drilling. The low flat decks taking up half their length or more are what give them their iconic shape when compared to many other vessels of their size. These ships serve in a variety of roles as needed, like anchor handling tug, standby vessels that carry additional emergency and rescue equipment, amongst several other variants, or the simple workhorse supply ship, using its open aft deck and dynamic positioning ability to maneuver near offshore structures and conduct cargo operations. Built in 1973 by McDermott Shipyard of Morgan City, Louisiana, at first simply named Ranger, the supply ship took part in offshore oil operations until it was purchased by Fishing Company of Alaska, or FCA, in 1987. From the U.S. Coast Guard, during the 1989 conversion, the vessel was raised to the main deck and reconstructed from that point upwards. The full length of the main deck was enclosed, providing space for the factory or processing space. And from the NTSB, the main working deck of the supply vessel became the fishing vessel's enclosed factory deck, and the Alaska Ranger made its maiden fishing voyage in May of 1989. And just to note, primary sources from today's video are the NTSB and Coast Guard investigative reports. Links to all the sources, references, and cross-references are in the description below. The vessel, converted at United Marine Shipbuilding in Seattle, Washington, would go from this simple supply ship layout to receiving a built-up main deck, built-up crew decks above that, with the trawl deck behind them, then accommodations above those, with an even wider house than before. And surrounding all this was shell plating that now reached up 2 decks higher than original to help enclose it all. The main gantry tower, stern ramp, and stern arch were necessary modifications for trawling, amongst many others. But this wasn't unheard of in the time period. The factory trawler business was changing rapidly as the regulation of Alaska fisheries was evolving, and supply ships throughout the years have regularly been abundant due to offshore drilling operations. A couple more examples from the same era. The Kodiak Enterprise, originally a supply ship built in 1977, converted to factory fishing vessel in '89. The Alaska Spirit, built in 1974 and converted in the early 90s. Important to note, the hull of these supply ships would have been engineered for the area it was intended. In the Ranger's case, offshore operations in the Gulf of Mexico, vastly different from the conditions of the Bering. The Alaska Ranger measured in, with a registered length of 189.4 feet, a width or beam of 40 feet, gross tonnage of 1,577, a draft depth of about 28 feet, and powered by 2 16-cylinder diesel engines, each putting out about 3,500 horsepower. And according to the NTSB, Fishing Company of Alaska, or FCA, contracted their engineering and maintenance work to Transmarine Propulsion Systems, or TMPS, of Seattle. In this Coast Guard publication, as of March 2007 at least, The commercial fishing vessel, or CFV, is broken into 3 subtypes: the fishing vessel, the fish tender vessel, and the fish processing vessel. And if you're interested in some of the unspoken, subtle lore happening as brick and mortar progresses, or for those eagle-eyed viewers out there who may have noticed already, an overarching theme I make an attempt at, behind the scenes, is to also familiarize viewers with the various classes of vessels within their respective categories, like the evolution and variations of ro-ro vessels, the conversion of World War II bunker ships to tankers that lived on for decades, the complexities of bulk cargo carriers, or the distinct differences in commercial fishing vessels. We've covered the fishing vessel, the fish tender vessel, and this video will be the introduction to the fish processing vessel and what makes it so different. And this is just a small peek into my creative process if you were interested. Speaking of the creative process, brick and mortar videos that memorialize victims don't contain sponsors, so supporters like those on Patreon play a major role in producing this content to such a high standard. Patrons get benefits like listenable ad-free podcast versions of every new video that you can enjoy with your device locked on the go, ad-free early access to each video release, access to the one-of-a-kind brick and mortar ambient music catalog that I remix myself, and much more. Check it out at patreon.com/brickandmortar. These floating fish factories, though, are perceived as a net negative by many in the industry. It's actually been quite the debate for decades. Take, for instance, fishing vessel Atlantic Dawn. At 472 feet long, pulling 1,000-foot wide nets through the ocean with ease. It's a ridiculously massive, exaggerated, almost fictional-seeming caricature of what the factory trawler can become, yet nonetheless does exist. Said to be overshadowed only by the even larger Vladivostok 2000. The Vladivostok is a converted vessel, handling fish processing only, and doesn't actually harvest. A controversial story in itself. Anyway, according to britishseafishing.co.uk, in an article from 2023 titled Atlantic Dawn, the Ship from Hell, Atlantic Dawn was, and still is today under its new name, the world's largest trawler, and the most controversial fishing vessel ever built. It helped make its owner a multimillionaire, but the political storm that the ship caused also highlighted the double dealing, greed, and blindness to the plight of the world's fish stocks that characterizes the large-scale commercial fishing industry. In general, factory trawlers are seen by their detractors as an over-efficient, overpowered competitor to the standard-sized trawler fleets and rural fishing communities relying on fishery co-ops to sustain themselves. To put this into perspective, when compared to their smaller counterparts fishing Alaskan waters, ships like the Alaska Ranger, for example, are huge, and their catches are huge, with fears that their bycatch rate of unintended species increases accordingly. They're much more costly to maintain if done properly. They require a crew 10 times larger, and their stores are so massive, they can operate independently of local support if they're so inclined. When catching whitefish, for example, processing on some means bringing the fish all the way to frozen fillets, and factory trawlers have no need for any sort of middleman or local processors. In many instances, they aren't scorned simply by environmentalists. It's local fishing communities often said to take issue with the highly industrialized, seemingly corporate methods. With a bycatch that has the potential to be so massive, it eats into the stocks of, say, another fisher's expected salmon catch. Just one example among many. But the demand is there, and factory trawlers fulfill it to this day. Important to note also is the argument that with proper regulation, which of course requires good faith adherence to it, they're capable of harvesting responsibly. Ultimately though, whether or not someone takes a dim view of an industry like this, the safety of those involved matters just the same. According to the NTSB, because of their ability to freeze, package, and store frozen catch, these vessels can operate in the most remote areas of the Bering Sea, far from search and rescue support. Vessels operating in these parts of the Bering can also encounter ice. It's not at the magnitude that brings to mind images of the ice-breaking cutter Polar Star, for example, plowing through polar ice pack, but still requires areas of the ship making contact to be properly reinforced. When the supply vessel Ranger was converted to factory trawler, due to a thick shear-strake plate already installed, a thicker plate that extended 4 feet below the factory deck, at the ship's hull approximately at the waterline, This was presumed to be ice-strengthening plating, and the new owners, FCA, would operate the vessel under the assumption that the Alaska Ranger was ice-classed, or certified to operate in icy waters, and pushing through ice when transiting the Bering wasn't uncommon. The stern of the vessel, aft of the trawl deck, was designed exclusively for deploying gear and bringing fish on board. Trawlers like this use what they call doors to help spread the net horizontally in a conical pattern, and large weights to hold the nets open vertically. The stern would see much abuse as the doors and weights are large, heavy, and regularly pulled up along with the nets and catch via the stern ramp, often striking on either side. Wear plates would be fitted to the stern on each side of the ramp in an effort to minimize the damage inflicted. The additional plating, welded to the stern, with a slight standoff, created a stern void or outer transom, basically an inaccessible, empty sealed-off space at the rear of the vessel. And from the U.S. Coast Guard, FCA installed quart nozzles on the Alaska Ranger in '91 to improve fuel efficiency. Essentially a ducted propeller, the nickname quart nozzle is used frequently in the maritime industry. The ducted propeller provides more efficiency at slower speeds and is thought to be beneficial when navigating ice, providing a certain amount of protection, keeping the blade edges unexposed. The trawler's main propulsion setup was two V16 3,500 horsepower diesel engines for a total of 7,000 horsepower, one to each screw. According to the NTSB, the Alaska Ranger had two conventional spade-type rudders, one behind each propeller. The rudders were controlled from the wheelhouse by an electro-hydraulic system. Each rudder stalk fit in a watertight housing, or trunk, that extended from the bottom hull plate to within about 20 inches of the rudder room overhead. The bottom of the rudder trunk was welded to the hull. Additionally, the Alaska Ranger was equipped with hydraulic-type controllable pitch propellers. To oversimplify, unlike a fixed-pitch propeller that, to achieve either forward or reverse, utilizes a gearbox to simply spin in one direction or the other, like you'd see in many recreational outboard motors, for example. The controllable or variable pitch propeller allows the blades to rotate about their axes. By changing this pitch, the forward speed can be controlled independently of engine RPM through positive pitch, or reverse can be achieved by rotating them in the opposite direction, known as negative pitch. From the NTSB, the electro-hydraulic system that controlled the Alaska Ranger's propellers was normally operated from the bridge. As originally configured, each propeller had one electrical pump and one pump that was mechanically driven off the main engine. The instruction manual states that the electrical pump was the main pump, with the mechanically driven pump serving as standby in case the other pump lost pressure. Documentation shows that after the mechanically driven pumps were damaged in late 1989, Transmarine replaced them with electric pumps due to part availability and expense of repairing existing units. According to a marine surveyor's report, from then on, the vessel ran with 2 electric pumps per propeller. Now, what this boils down to is that during loss of electrical power, the propellers will go into full reverse configuration. Many ships like these can have main propulsion systems, the huge diesel engines, and electrical systems that operate independently of one another. The hydraulic operation of the propeller's pitch, utilizing engine power, would be the redundancy or backup in this case, and vice versa. An option the Alaska Ranger didn't have, since they'd utilize electrical pumps only on each propeller from 1989 on. And just to be clear, Fishing Company of Alaska was fully aware of this. In addition, these FCA factory trawlers, and roughly 20 others in the Bering Sea, Aleutian Island fisheries at the time, were part of what's known as the Amendment 80 fleet. The amendment originally implemented in '82 and going through several revisions since. In an effort to achieve species conservation and sustainability, a fleet of trawler processors, all with original build dates that happened to be pre-1990, were each granted license under Amendment 80 to fish for certain species in the area, with a maximum allotment for each species based on the vessel's historical catch numbers. But, at the time of this report at least, the regulation had, some would say, unintended effects of discouraging new or replacement factory trawlers from being granted license to fish under Amendment 80. This was partly to encourage fishing co-ops, something many see factory trawlers as direct opposition to. More importantly, it created a situation where the aging factory trawlers, quote, grandfathered in, would continue to see heavy use because they simply weren't being replaced, despite their age and potential fatigue. The Alaska Ranger would also undergo numerous repairs to damaged and fatigued areas, some of which critical to watertight integrity of the stern throughout its life. Regarding the stern alone, for instance, in the aft ballast tanks. In 1996, a fractured weld repaired in the frame of the starboard aft tank. September of 2004, free communication, meaning water flowing freely, between the port and starboard tanks. December of 2004, the centerline bulkhead repaired, requiring 143 hours of labor. January of 2005, the centerline bulkhead re-welded. October of 2005, the centerline bulkhead re-welded again. April of 2007, leaks discovered with the cause and exact location unknown. Then the centerline bulkhead of the aft ballast tanks comes up again multiple times, with a note in March of 2008 stating, "The needed repairs still remain incomplete and were on FCA's work list." In the transom and stern ramp areas specifically, December of 2001, damage discovered on both sides of transom stern requiring complete reinforcement, with the stern ramp leaking as well. October of 2005, damage from trawl doors resulting in fractures of plating on outer transom. Additional doubler plate installed. Important to note, doubler plating means essentially just welding additional plate over problem areas, like you'd patch a hole in rusted body panels on a car. The NTSB states, doubler plate repairs can lead to increased stress concentrated in the area of the repair. Doubler plating also inhibits the ability to assess the true condition of the hull. November of 2005 and November of 2007. Exact same entries. Major work performed, new doubler plates installed, repairs to outer transom, port and starboard. But the list goes on with doubler plates being added, corroded weld seams discovered, fractures in the vessel's main frame, amongst many others throughout. Another major exemption these aging vessels were allowed was being part of what's known as the Head and Gut, or H&G fleet. This fleet of 60-plus ships were exempt from U.S. Coast Guard inspection up until 2006, when a program to try and get them up to code was enacted called the Alternate Compliance and Safety Agreement, or ACSA. Quote, to achieve an equivalent level of safety to classification and load line requirements, vessel owners wishing to participate in the ACSA program were required to submit an application by July 15 of 2006. From the NTSB, a Coast Guard document dated January of 2008 lists only 7 vessels as being in full compliance with the ACSA requirements. The program was administered from Seattle, the home port of the H&G fleet, and the examinations were conducted primarily by a marine inspector from Coast Guard Sector Seattle. Tracking and managing all the vessels that were attempting to meet the ACSA requirements proved too much for one person, and the Coast Guard did not know the status of most vessels well after the compliance deadlines had passed. At the end of February 2008, the Coast Guard issued a 30-day blanket extension to vessels that had applied to the program but had not yet met the requirements, with a request that the owners inform the Coast Guard about the status of outstanding work. And indeed, the Alaska Ranger service records show upcoming work and plans that mention ACSA and the Coast Guard's marine inspectors, but regarding the aft ballast tanks, for example, quote, there was considerable confusion regarding the actual condition of the bulkhead in the months leading up to the incident. The propeller pitch control, the exemptions, the DISREPAIR, the lacking inspections would all catch up with the Alaska Ranger. Dutch Harbor, Friday, March 21, 2008. With the complement of 45 crew, plus 2 fishery observers, the Alaska Ranger returned to port at Dutch Harbor in the Aleutians due to, quote, southward moving ice that pushed it out of the fishing grounds. They'd been after yellowfin sole, a bottom trawl, before calling it off. So, once in port, the crew would have to change gear in preparation to fish for mackerel, a midwater trawl. In addition, they'd take on fuel, restock stores, but decided to not yet offload the fish caught between March 19th and 22nd. While the ship was primarily crewed by Fishing Company of Alaska, or FCA, there were personnel on board from a total of 3 different employers, not uncommon for this type of vessel. Of the 40 FCA crew members, there were 2 deck officers, 3 engineering officers, 2 cooks, 1 steward, and the remaining 32 worked in the factory space. According to the Coast Guard, factory workers were divided into 3 groups, and each group worked for 12 hours, followed by 6 hours off. The groups continuously rotated through the factory, which operated 24 hours a day to process catch. 2 groups worked in the factory at any given time. And if the working conditions sound miserable, I have it on good authority that it's because they were. The amount of experience the factory workers ranged from several years to just a couple days. One factory worker, with no prior fishing vessel experience, had just joined the Alaska Ranger in Dutch Harbor during that brief time in port. They weren't necessarily previous seafarers or mariners, although some were. Some of the factory crew had additional positions and responsibilities, such as bosun and deckhand. These crew members worked on deck during fishing operations, then also worked in the factory as needed. From the NTSB, 5 crew members were Japanese nationals. The Japanese crew members were not employees of FCA, but worked for North Pacific Resources, the U.S. subsidiary of a Japanese company, Anyo Fisheries Company Limited. North Pacific Resources had an exclusive agreement to purchase all catches from FCA vessels. According to North Pacific Resources info, FCA vessels carried Fishmasters to ensure the harvest of adequate numbers of the desired target species. And from the U.S. Coast Guard, the Japanese chief engineer managed the maintenance of the refrigeration plant, hydraulics for the fishing equipment, and factory equipment. And the remaining Japanese technicians assisted with fishing activities and maintenance of the refrigeration plant and fishing gear. And, as an aside, an interesting bit of trivia regarding the history of fishing in this area. Foreign fleets, primarily from Japan and Russia, accounted for most commercial fishing in the Bering Sea and Gulf of Alaska until 1986. According to the NTSB, the fishing season began on January 20 and generally lasted until October. Different species were targeted as the year progressed. And from NOAA.gov, sea ice begins forming in the northern Bering Sea as late as November, and the ocean reaches a temperature of minus 1.7 degrees Celsius, the freezing point for salt water in this area, and ice may remain into June of the following year. Continued from the NTSB, FCA's operations manager believed that the vessel's hull had been certified for operation in ice, or ice-classed, during the original classification survey in 1973. He also stated that the hull had a reinforced band above and below the waterline. At this time, including the Alaska Ranger, FCA operated a fleet of 7 vessels total, all with the Alaska prefix. The Alaska Patriot, Spirit, Pioneer, Warrior, Victory, and Juris. The ranking officers aboard the Alaska Ranger were the Master, Captain Jacobson, a 65-year-old seafarer who'd worked for FCA since the company's inception in '85 and held multiple licenses: Master of Steam or Motor Vessels on near coastal waters, Master for Uninspected Fishing Industry Vessels on near coastal waters, and a mate's license for steam or motor vessels on oceans. He'd served as mate on 4 other FCA factory ships and was already serving on the Alaska Ranger when he became master on March 5, 2008, only a couple weeks prior to this story actually. First Mate Silvera, referred to as just the mate, interchangeable with first mate, first officer, and sometimes chief mate or chief officer, depending on the vessel or company, essentially second in command on deck to the captain. In this instance, simplifying it to just mate is likely due to there being only 2 deck officers total. The mate was a 50-year-old officer who held a master's license. After being hired on to FCA in '92, he'd spent various times as either master or mate on all 7 of their factory vessels. He'd come aboard the Alaska Ranger as mate also on March 5, 2008. In charge of engineering was Chief Engineer Cook, a 65-year-old seafarer who worked briefly for FCA in '94, then exited to work for another maritime company and returned to FCA in '07. He'd served as chief engineer at that time, aboard the Alaska Patriot, the Alaska Victory, then transitioned to the Alaska Ranger on January 3, 2008. He was in charge of maintenance and 2 other engineering assistant crew members, one for day shift, the other for nights. The Fishmaster. On the Japanese crew representing Anyo Fisheries Company was Fishmaster Kono-san, who'd actually been in his position aboard the Alaska Ranger since 2005. It's been reported, amongst industry insiders, the Fishmasters aboard these FCA vessels were the ones actually in charge of each trawler, overriding the FCA crew's authority regularly. However, the authorities' reports do not go into this in depth. And the 2 National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA observers on board, a common sight on vessels like these, had been aboard since March 4th and March 19th, respectively. These observers live aboard to supervise the catch and, quote, monitor operations and collect catch data, such as fish length and species, that are used in managing more than 40 U.S. fisheries, including those off Alaska. Important to note, according to NOAA.gov, trainees must be able to don an immersion suit in less than 1 minute and enter the water and climb into a floating life raft while wearing the suit. In addition to being trained by their own employer, the federal government, the observers also supplied their own personal immersion suits. And regarding personal survival and safety, observers are often the most thoroughly trained individuals on board vessels like these. The Alaska Ranger was equipped with an estimated 55 immersion suits, each one equipped with an automated strobe light, 3 inflatable life rafts, each with a rated capacity for 20 personnel, also equipped with strobe lights, and an emergency position indicating radio beacon, or EPIRB. The U.S. Coast Guard points out, aboard the Alaska Ranger, monthly training focused largely on mustering and donning survival suits. Other elements like abandoning, firefighting, recovering an individual from the water, dewatering and/or damage control, distress calls, or reporting inoperative alarms were not provided monthly to all hands, only to members of the emergency squad, which consisted of the factory manager, a factory lead, 3 factory workers, a deckhand, and a bosun. And the master, mate, and 1 assistant engineer were also trained or certified in various damage control and/or safety capacities. From the U.S. Coast Guard, quote, despite the lack of a dedicated safety budget and written training program, the commercial fishing vessel safety examiners who conducted exams on FCA vessels testified that the company's employees were professional and cooperative when addressing matters related to safety. One examiner even stated that FCA always demonstrated concern with regards to safety. Just a bit after noon, Saturday, March 22nd, the Alaska Ranger would get underway from Dutch Harbor toward an area of the Bering Sea known as Petrel Bank, fishing grounds roughly 500 nautical miles due west, on the hunt for mackerel. At the time, heading toward Petrel Bank would take them away from the ice they'd encountered previously. Recorded at 12:36 p.m., the wind was out of the northwest at 15 knots, gusting to 27 knots. Visibility was 2 miles with light snow and blowing snow. Air temperature was 25 degrees Fahrenheit, and water temps were approximately 32 to 35 degrees Fahrenheit. The National Weather Service called for conditions to deteriorate throughout the day and night, issuing gale and freezing spray warnings for the areas they transit. Winds expected to increase to 40 knots, gusts up to 55 knots, with seas of up to 13 feet. More snow showers and heavy freezing spray throughout Saturday night into Sunday the 23rd. From the NTSB, according to the FCA operations manager, transit time to Petrel Bank was 2 to 2.5 days. The operations manager said that the crew ordinarily rested while the vessel traveled to the fishing grounds. When there is no fish, they will sleep and watch a movie and things. At 7 p.m. Saturday evening, the watch would change, as the night engineer relieved the day engineer, and the mate relieved the captain on deck. Around 2 a.m. Sunday, March 23rd, with the mate on watch and the Alaska Ranger's transit seemingly uneventful so far, he'd receive a call from his counterpart, the mate on the Alaska Spirit. The Spirit, behind the Alaska Ranger by roughly 115 miles, was also heading towards Petrel Bank. Speaking via each vessel's satellite phone, the two deck officers would discuss, quote, personal stuff in a casual conversation that lasted about 25 minutes until 2:26 a.m. Weather conditions had worsened, with waves now at an average 8 feet, and individual waves up to 16 feet. But there was no mention of any trouble during this call. According to the Spirit's mate, all seemed normal. Then, about 10 minutes later, at 2:36 a.m., the Ranger's mate called the mate back on the Spirit and calmly let him know, "Come this way. I don't know what's going to go on here, but we're taking water inside the rudder room." The Ranger's mate then asked him to call the Coast Guard on their behalf, the SCA company office in Dutch Harbor, and any other boats in the fleet he could reach, which the Spirit's mate did follow up on, according to the vessel's satellite phone records. Back on the Alaska Ranger, though, a lot had transpired between those calls. At roughly 120 miles west of Dutch Harbor and 60-plus miles from any sort of landmass, the nighttime engineer, on watch in the engine room, was suddenly alerted to a bilge alarm indicating high water in the ship's rudder room. According to the NTSB, he said that he immediately went to investigate, opened the watertight door from the auxiliary machinery space to the rudder room, and saw, quote, a wall of water coming toward him. He said that he closed the door, but the seals leaked, so he secured the dogs with a hammer, which stopped the leaking. Dogs are the fasteners that clamp a watertight door or hatch securely into its frame. Like in movies or TV shows where you see the frantic sailor spinning the big wheel to shut the hatch tightly. It can depend on the style of door or hatch, but that's one example of ensuring the hatch is, quote, dogged. As soon as he'd finished securing the rudder room door, the night engineer immediately called up to the pilot house from the auxiliary machinery, or hydraulics room, the next compartment forward from the rudder room. He, quote, reported major flooding in the rudder room and told the mate to sound the general alarm. He then called the chief engineer immediately after to inform him as well. The mate quickly sounded the alarm, which was estimated to be around 2:30 a.m. Most crew members were in their rooms or in the galley when the general alarm sounded. This prompted all crew members to begin mustering in the wheelhouse, with the exception of those in the emergency squad attempting damage control. After contacting the mate in the wheelhouse, the night engineer then notified the chief engineer that the vessel was flooding. He then got to work configuring the bilge and ballast pumps to pump water from the rudder room, auxiliary machinery space, and engine room. Members of the emergency squad went aft to also assist and assess. They saw both watertight doors to the ramp room on the factory deck were open, and that the ramp room was flooded up to their shins. The aft workshop contained a portable emergency pump that the squad quickly started setting up on the main deck. But before they got it running, the night engineer and Japanese chief engineer emerged from below decks and instructed the squad to muster at the wheelhouse in preparation to abandon. As the emergency squad made their way to the wheelhouse, the night engineer and Japanese chief engineer returned aft to the ramp room, which was still filling with water. Presumably, they intended to stop the flooding however they could, but weren't able to locate where the water was actually coming from. Soon they heard popping from electrical transformers in the ramp room that were becoming submerged. They were only able to close one of the ramp room's watertight doors, as the soon-to-be submerged transformers posed a significant risk of electrocution. They closed one more watertight door between the workshop and ladder well before making their way to the wheelhouse. Once the two arrived, the Japanese chief engineer reported to their team's Fishmaster, who then instructed him and one of the other Japanese technicians, quote, back to the engine room 3 or 4 times to check on the extent of the flooding. They reported that the water levels in the engine room's bilges were steadily rising, but it's unclear whether the officers on deck were aware of their findings. The night engineer would testify later that it was around this time or soon after the captain told him the engine room bilges were dry. By this point, the stern was riding low but not underwater. The Alaska Ranger's mate would then make that 2:36 a.m. call back to the Alaska Spirit, informing him of the potentially developing situation. While the Spirit was about 150 miles behind the Ranger, The Alaska Warrior was actually only 40 miles behind, headed in the same direction as well. At 2:42 a.m., the Spirit called the Warrior and informed them of the Ranger's situation. The Warrior continued toward the scene at its maximum speed of 10 knots. At 2:46 a.m., the Alaska Ranger would make its first Mayday broadcast. The U.S. Coast Guard communication station in Kodiak, Alaska, or ComStay Kodiak, would respond immediately. The Alaska Ranger gave precise coordinates and remained in contact with the Coast Guard. By 2:54 a.m., ComStay Kodiak began relaying the information to the U.S. Coast Guard Rescue Coordination Center, or RCC, in Juneau, also referred to as D-17 in their report, meaning the District 17 area of responsibility covering the northern Pacific and Bering Sea. And the Coast Guard would also request the Alaska Ranger to manually activate their EPIRB, or Emergency Position Indicating Radio Beacon. The command center immediately ordered 2 rescue aircraft to the scene, and high-endurance cutter Monroe, WHEC 724, was diverted toward them as well. The Monroe also carried an HH-65 Dolphin short-range medevac helicopter. By 2:58, ComStay Kodiak would begin to check in with the Alaska Ranger in 5-minute intervals. All assets would take some time, though, to reach the scene, that far out on the Bering. Back on board the stricken factory ship, as those emergency squad members attempted damage control, the remaining crew had quickly mustered in or near the wheelhouse and donned survival suits in an orderly fashion. The chief cook and a factory leader took charge of maintaining the head count, but the immersion suit gloves made utilizing the muster sheets difficult. Add to that, once one of them could start comparing a muster sheet he finally got a hold of, according to the Coast Guard, they found it out of date. It didn't accurately reflect the current crew. Fortunately, due to his position on the vessel, the factory leader was familiar with who was on board and was able to account for personnel. The 40-plus personnel, now in their immersion suits, were crowding the wheelhouse. From the U.S. Coast Guard, due to noise and cigarette smoke, the captain had everyone muster on the weather deck outside the pilot house. To help them stay warm, the chief cook asked and received permission for crew members to return to the pilot house in small groups, with groups of 5 rotating through, each staying approximately 5 minutes at a time to get warm. With their survival suits donned, crew members watched as the freeboard at the stern steadily decreased. Eventually, the stern was awash, and fishing nets and gear were swept off the trawl deck by waves. From the NTSB, the day engineer who was on the bridge stated that the chief engineer came to the wheelhouse and reported the vessel had lost a rudder and that they needed to abandon ship. At 3:10 a.m., either the mate or captain reports to the Coast Guard that they'd lost a rudder. With main engine still running, the night engineer and captain left the wheelhouse to investigate the extent of the flooding. According to the night engineer, the captain told him, regarding the engine still running, quote, he didn't want to be dead in the water. The vessel's electrical systems cut out, and emergency lighting and backup power sources kicked on at around 3:30 a.m. With the primary propulsion still running, it's presumed the downflooding shorted the electrical systems. Shortly after, though, the situation went from bad, yet still afloat, to an almost instant nightmare. Crew members looked on as the Alaska Ranger suddenly began noticeably reversing under its own power, backing down into the frigid, dark, up to 20-foot high seas. As the night engineer and captain made their way back to the wheelhouse, the engineer noticed, quote, at that time we were still level, so I thought we were going to be all right. Before they made it up to the bridge deck, the trawler listed hard to starboard, with some crew members convinced they'd been hit by a large wave on the port side. Others claiming they didn't notice a wave, but that the list was sudden and significant regardless. The list quickly worsened, and the vessel showed no signs of recovering. Presumably back in or near the wheelhouse, the night engineer and captain finally donned their immersion suits, and at 4:02 a.m., Alaska Ranger notified ComStay Kodiak they would be abandoning soon. By roughly 4 a.m., the Coast Guard had launched 2 aircraft. A C-130 from Air Station Kodiak, roughly 800 miles away, and an HH-60 Jayhawk medium-range search and rescue helicopter. The Jayhawk happened to be stationed much closer though, about 230 miles away at St. Paul on the Pribilof Islands. The Coast Guard keeping it stationed there during the months of January through April to help bolster search and rescue operations when conditions are dangerous for Bering Sea fishing vessels. Cutter Monroe was making best speed toward the scene at roughly 30 knots and was about 130 miles away when the call came in. The HH-65 Dolphin, a short-range search and rescue helo, would be able to launch from the Monroe once they were in range. Each helicopter had the same 4 crew positions on board: a pilot, a co-pilot, a flight mechanic, the crew member at the side door operating the hoist, amongst many other tasks surrounding it, and a rescue swimmer. Due to its proximity, the Alaska Warrior was due to be on scene prior to the Monroe. As the Alaska Ranger continued its perilous roll to starboard, the crew worked desperately to get all 3 life rafts launched. However, once they were inflated and in the water, the ship's momentum, still in reverse, or moving astern, meant the life rafts immediately pulled away and traveled past the bow. The lines hadn't broke free yet on all of them, and the chief cook ripped the palms of his immersion suit's gloves, trying to pull one back alongside so crew members could embark, but to no avail. By 4:16 a.m., some confusion had set in, since life rafts were now unreachable. The bridge communicated to the Coast Guard that they'd lost the life rafts and would now have the crew remain with the stricken vessel. But less than 10 minutes later, 2 people went overboard as the starboard list reached 45 degrees. With ambient temperatures at 16 degrees Fahrenheit, winds at 26 knots bringing the wind chill to -24 with heavy snow, water temperatures at 32 degrees, and waves are reported 20 to 25 feet high, the crew would have no choice but to enter the dark, deadly waters in their immersion suits. They began entering the water by about 4:23 a.m., and 7 minutes later, the Jayhawk was entering radio range. The captain, still on board the doomed ship, reported directly to the helo crew the 45-degree list and that the vessel would soon roll over completely. He also let them know 7 crew members were still with the vessel and that all others had abandoned. The Jayhawk crew would also establish communications with the Alaska Warrior. The Warrior still about 13 miles east and making best speed. And important to note, sunrise wouldn't come until about 9 a.m. By roughly 5:05 a.m., the helo arrived within what should have been visual range of the Alaska Ranger, yet it was nowhere to be found. The vessel had sunk around 4:30 a.m. in water 6,000 feet deep. The Jayhawk crew would approach a couple strobe lights they assumed were life rafts, but as they closed in, the 2 or 3 bright strobes were surrounded by dozens of other smaller ones attached to individuals as well. The Jayhawk made contact with an Alaska Ranger crew member who carried a handheld VHF radio aboard one of the life rafts. The crew member reported those in the life raft were in good condition, and so the helo crew prioritized those floating freely in their immersion suits. Their rescue swimmer was deployed soon after, and the team, quote, began hoisting survivors from the water one at a time. They rescued 2 persons that were floating together, followed by a group of 6, another pair, and then a group of 3. The assumed 13 total survivors on board brought them to max capacity, but no vessels had arrived on scene by this point. They'd recover their rescue swimmer and fly to the Alaska Warrior in hopes of lowering survivors onto the trawler's deck. Attempting to lower survivors by 6:04 a.m., they'd realize, unfortunately, the Warrior did not have enough open deck space to lower survivors safely, and were forced to depart the scene and rush toward Cutter Monroe, further out but still easily within the Jayhawk's range. The Monroe previously launched its Dolphin helo at about 5:55 a.m., meaning the aft deck landing pad would be clear to receive the Jayhawk's full load of survivors. Important to note though, the helicopter deck on the Monroe, while built for the HH-65 Dolphin, is not made to safely take on the larger HH-60 Jayhawk. By 6:20 a.m., The Coast Guard HC-130 was overhead, on scene, now providing overwatch, accounting for strobe lights they could make out in the darkness, helping to coordinate the helicopters, and communicating with the Alaska Warrior to guide them toward life rafts. At 6:33 a.m., the Dolphin deployed their rescue swimmer and initially hoisted up a group of 3 survivors, one by one, recovered the swimmer, and rushed towards another group. This group appeared to be possibly waving them off to help others, motioning towards what ended up being a pair some distance away, entangled in fishing gear and debris. The struggling, entangled pair was the day engineer assisting another crew member who appeared unresponsive to the helo crew and their rescue swimmer, and thus the unresponsive crew member was prioritized. In the U.S. Coast Guard's own words, watching the rescue swimmer struggle for several minutes while trying to get the crew member into the basket, due to the weather and lack of a visual reference for the pilots. Further complicating the situation were the seas that were pushing the rescue swimmer and crew member back underneath the helicopter toward its tail. And aware that the HH-65 was getting low on fuel, as he listened to the pilots discuss the helicopter's limited fuel supply, the flight mechanic began hoisting, when it appeared the crew member was in the rescue basket. However, the rescue swimmer never signaled for the hoist to begin. When the rescue basket reached the helicopter, the crew member was hanging onto the basket, but his legs and torso were dangling outside of the basket, and the flight mechanic could not bring the basket into the cabin. Due to the combined weight of the crew member and the water in his survival suit, the flight mechanic was then unable to lift or pull the crew member from the basket into the cabin. As the flight mechanic turned to grab a knife or webbing cutter to cut and drain the water from the survival suit, the crew member slipped from the basket and fell to the water approximately 40 to 60 feet below. But the rescue swimmer had already moved on toward the day engineer to prep him for retrieval, was about 70 yards away from where the crew member fell and couldn't see him through the waves. Arriving at the Monroe by 6:44 a.m., the larger Jayhawk would have to lower those original 12 to 13 survivors one by one onto the deck. The cutter's crew rushing them to the nearby mess deck they'd prepped for triage and treatment. The cutter had taken over operational command from RCC Juneau, using its CIC, or Combat Information Center, now that the ship was nearing the scene. Upon radioing to the cutter's bridge, the Jayhawk had reported 13 rescued, but the bridge assessed only 12 total. According to the NTSB, the information about this discrepancy did not get relayed to the Search and Rescue Coordination Command in the Monroe's CIC. Once the survivors were clear of the helo and ship's aft deck, the Jayhawk and Monroe crews made preparations for helicopter in-flight refueling. Since the HH-60 is too large for the Monroe's deck and can't simply land to take on more fuel, these crews trained for this situation to extend Coast Guard helo patrol or search and rescue duration, sending the refueling hose up with a special adapter on the end to the flight mechanic via the same hoist used for survivors, where the crew member then initiates the fuel flow and, once complete, returns the hose back down to the crew on deck. Back on scene, the Dolphin was getting critically low on fuel and needed to return to the Monroe. Their rescue swimmer was near a group of 3 survivors, and so the helo's crew dropped a small life raft near them and headed back to the cutter, leaving the rescue swimmer to attend as best he could to those in the water. In the meantime, at 7:26 a.m., the Alaska Warrior had finally arrived and immediately set about trying to recover a life raft with survivors on board. It was a struggle at first as they attempted to pull up alongside and have survivors climb aboard a ladder, but conditions made this impossible, so the crew quickly jumped into action and used their crane and a harness to lift them on board one by one, eventually getting all 10 of the raft's occupants on board safely. The Dolphin's fuel situation was critical, and the Jayhawk was still in the middle of their own refueling operations at the Monroe. About halfway through the process, the HH-60 and Monroe crews cut it short, stopping the process early as the Monroe brought in the refueling line and made best possible speed toward the Dolphin in an effort to close the distance between them. The Jayhawk had taken on enough fuel to at least stay on mission and proceeded back toward the Alaska Ranger scene. While the Dolphin and Monroe met soon after, with the aircraft touching down safely, its 3 crew delivering 5 survivors. The Monroe and Dolphin crews would begin hot refueling operations. The Jayhawk crew was back on scene by about 8 a.m., where the Alaska Warrior was making a successful recovery of a second life raft, recovering 12 more survivors successfully. The Jayhawk set about recovering 3 more individuals floating out on their own, and picked up the Dolphin's rescue swimmer in the process. The Jayhawk then recovered another victim who appeared unresponsive, and continued a thorough search, with their rescue swimmer confirming all 3 of the Alaska Ranger's life rafts were now empty. The helo would drop a data marker buoy used to help gauge the drift conditions for data gathering to aid in search patterns, and then departed for Cutter Monroe. By 9:07 a.m., the Dolphin, still without their rescue swimmer, was just lifting off Monroe's deck as the Jayhawk approached to deliver the 4 rescued crew members. Of the 4, 1 remained unresponsive, the mate, and despite the Monroe crew's best efforts, they could not revive him. With the Dolphin's rescue swimmer aboard the Jayhawk, the aircraft commanders agreed the Dolphin would take the Jayhawk's rescue swimmer and return to the scene. The Jayhawk lowered the rescued crew members and both rescue swimmers onto the Monroe. The Dolphin then picked up the rescue swimmer and departed at approximately 9:55 a.m. to return to the scene. At 10:10 a.m., the Alaska Warrior was recovering 3 more victims, all of which unresponsive, one of them being very difficult to recover as his suit had filled with water. These 3 were the captain, chief engineer, and that crew member who'd fallen from the basket earlier. Despite the crew's best efforts, the 3 could not be revived. By 10:12 a.m., the Cutter Monroe was now reporting 22 Alaska Ranger crew members aboard, and the Alaska Warrior counted 25 on board theirs, a combined total of 47. With this information, Coast Guard Command announced search efforts would then be suspended. By roughly 11 a.m., the Dolphin would be recalled back to the Monroe, and the Jayhawk would depart for St. Paul. The Alaska Warrior and Cutter Monroe would rendezvous and steam together toward Dutch Harbor. From the U.S. Coast Guard, and a reminder, D-17 is just referring to overall command for this search and rescue operation. At 12:15 p.m., D-17 determined that 1 person was missing. After collecting the names of the survivors aboard the CGC Monroe and the Alaska Warrior, D-17 realized the Japanese Fishmaster remained unaccounted for. Though they had reported they'd brought aboard 22, Monroe actually only had 21 Alaska Ranger crew members on board. Search efforts immediately resumed using the Monroe, another HC-130, and the HH-60. With the Alaska Warrior still presumably underway toward Dutch Harbor, Alaska Spirit, Alaska Victory, and Alaska Juris would eventually arrive on scene to also join in the search for the Fishmaster. The Coast Guard reports they suspended their search for a second and final time at 9:12 p.m. that night, Monday, March 24th, while the FCA ships remained on scene, continuing the search. In total, 42 crew members were rescued, suffering various degrees of hypothermia. 4 crew members were recovered, deceased: the master, mate, chief engineer, and a factory worker. And the Fishmaster remained missing, eventually presumed to be deceased. With the Alaska Ranger now at the bottom of the Bering, in 6,000 feet of water, it would be down to testimony, service records, and other documentary evidence to determine cause and pursue lessons learned. From the NTSB, the Safety Board participated fully in a Coast Guard Marine Board of Investigation convened immediately after the sinking. The NTSB's investigation identified the following safety issues: the vessel's movement astern, company operations, post-accident drug and alcohol testing, emergency response, implementation of the Coast Guard's alternate compliance and safety agreement, and oversight of U.S. commercial fishing industry vessels. While both the Coast Guard and NTSB point out that we'll likely never know where in the vessel's stern the flooding initiated, both teams had a lot to go on with the vessel's well-documented history and the incident's many witnesses. As the NTSB points out, After the Alaska Ranger began taking on water in the rudder room, the crew reported to the Coast Guard that they had lost steering and thought the vessel had lost a rudder. Possible reasons for a rudder loss include design or manufacturing flaws, poor maintenance, improper installation, mechanical failure, metal fatigue, or vessel operations. If a rudder stock fell out of its mounting on the night of the accident, it would have left a hole 8 5/8 inches in diameter, the inside diameter of the locking ring at the top of the rudder trunk. According to the post-accident stability analysis by the Coast Guard's Marine Safety Center, a 9-inch hole, approximately the diameter of each locking ring, would have flooded the rudder room in less than 5 minutes. 5 minutes corresponds roughly to the night engineer's testimony that he heard the rudder room bilge alarm and then quickly secured the rudder room door when he saw water pouring toward him. Although the night engineer's watchkeeping habits were also in question, something we will discuss after the NTSB's findings. This potential loss of a rudder, though, was but one symptom of an overall unhealthy stern. As mentioned before, due to Amendment 80 in a sense, discouraging new factory trawlers to enter fishing fleets in the Bering and Aleutian fisheries, while allowing the older fleet to remain in operation, this creates a somewhat obvious issue, where owners or operators will continue pushing aging, tired vessels past their prime, the Bering Sea being particularly brutal. This grandfathering in, plus the exemption from Coast Guard inspection, makes another, seemingly obvious hole in the Swiss cheese model that likely could have been prevented years, even decades prior. While, quote, uninspected fishing vessel means it would be exempt from the U.S. Coast Guard certificated inspections, it's not always the case that these vessels just go without inspections entirely. The Alaska Ranger underwent several examinations and surveys throughout its life, in addition to the required safety inspections it was subject to. Recent to the sinking, in November of 2007, the Alaska Ranger, Juris, and Warrior entered dry dock at Yamanishi Shipyard in Japan to, quote, undergo repairs and maintenance, make factory modifications, and receive the USCG dry dock and internal structural examinations required for enrollment in the Coast Guard's new Alternate Compliance and Safety Agreement, or ACSA program. The U.S. Coast Guard Marine inspectors that took part noted several deficiencies. When asked about the corrosion in the port aft tank and if he was able to report further about the rest of that tank's integrity, the Marine inspector stated, quote, it's a maze. I could have missed any portion of it because there's some areas that you could not go through. Very limited access to it. Even the lighting hole is too small, so you just stick your head in there and put your flashlight on to see if there's any significant wastage. But reports also took issue with what they're referring to as the outer transom by the Marine Board. This additional plating created a stern void that had a potential for corrosion issues. From the U.S. Coast Guard, FCA installed the outer transom in order to protect the hull plating from damage during fishing operations. However, no provisions were made to permit internal examinations of the narrow void between the outer transom and the hull plating, or to protect the steel from corrosion, while Transmarine ensured the insides of each rudder were coated when the vessel was in the dry dock, and that sacrificial anodes, rust-proof coatings, were applied to the hull and internal compartments to prevent corrosion. Nothing was done to protect the framing and inaccessible plating of the outer transom or the hull plating it protected. And in this photo from 2005, which coincides, presumably, with repair entries from either October 17th or November 13th, the outer transom can be seen leaking water from these voids. In addition, the NTSB's report of the 2007 dry dock inspection points out, and keep in mind, just 4 months prior to the incident, in October and November 2007, 4 months before it sank, the Alaska Ranger underwent a dry dock examination in Isinimiki, Japan, to establish compliance with the requirements of the Coast Guard's voluntary ACSA program. The Chief Coast Guard Examiner for uninspected fishing vessels in Seattle, qualified marine inspector, traveled with another examiner to Japan to conduct the exam, along with 2 Coast Guard marine inspectors stationed in Japan. The examination included a hull gauging using the standard ultrasonic technique. But the chief examiner said that he had no as-built plate thicknesses to compare with the 07 readings, and that he therefore averaged the various gaugings for a given plate to estimate the plate thickness. The stern, including the wear plates and the interior plates next to the void spaces, was not gauged during the dry dock examination, according to the Chief Coast Guard examiner, nor was gauging done on the interior or exterior plates of the stern ramp. The Coast Guard examiner told the Marine Board, "There's no reason to take shots, do audio gauging on the stern because there's a wear plate back there," which, as we covered, the wear plate is covering up the actual condition of the stern. From the U.S. Coast Guard, it's not clear whether this floodwater came from a hull breach or upward from the rudder room below. However, our model suggested that with the rudder room flooded, the deck and the ramp room would have been 2 feet below the static waterline, making a hull breach a reasonable source of flooding. It's important to note also that while the Marine Board does concur the flooding originated somewhere in or near the rudder room, quote, the Marine Board does not believe a rudder was lost, providing an in-depth explanation which I'll summarize here. They didn't feel sudden rudder loss would have been possible, that it would have instead needed to work its way loose over a period of what sounds to be either several hours, days, or more, and if so, quote, it would create abnormal sounds in the rudder room. The vessel's engineers, who should have been in the rudder room to grease the bearings and inspect the equipment during normal machinery space rounds, should have seen or heard telltale signals alerting them to the problem. Additionally, despite observing flooding in the rudder and ramp rooms, none of the crew mentioned hearing loud noises, such as cracking, splitting, hammering, or knocking. Unusual vibrations, shudders, or impacts were not reported either. Finally, no steering or propulsion problems were observed prior to the discovery of flooding. The Coast Guard also illustrates several scenarios they believe were possible. The simulations they used factored in flooding only, and not wind or sea conditions. These all assume flooding began in or near the rudder room, but how it spread, the starboard list, the duration before sinking, these factors were considered when determining which portions of the vessel experienced continued flooding after the rudder room had filled. While both investigation teams could not conclusively determine the initial flooding point, one issue seemed paramount in the Coast Guard's summary based on their calculations and simulations. Quote, certain bulkheads and decks were not watertight as demonstrated by the progressive flooding that took place. In summary, the analysis demonstrates the vessel would have survived the initial stages of flooding had it been controlled with either sufficient dewatering or adequate watertight boundaries. If flooding had been contained to the rudder room, the vessel would not have sunk. With only the rudder room flooded, the heel would not have changed appreciably. The minimum freeboard would have been almost 7 feet, and the height of the lowest downflooding point would have been over 11 feet above the waterline. Even as flooding progressed to the ramp room, harbor generator room, aft machinery alley, and workshop, the vessel would have survived the flooding. Once the uncontrolled flooding reached the engine room and exceeded the capacity of the dewatering pumps, the sinking of Alaska Ranger was assured. However, while investigators felt the Alaska Ranger sinking was caused by this progressive flooding by the stern, as the NTSB puts it, contributing to the loss of life was the vessel's movement astern, which likely accelerated the flooding and caused the life rafts to swing out of reach of many crew members. That deadly movement in reverse after losing electrical power. The sinking also wasn't the first time the Controllable Pitch Propeller System, or CPP, had suddenly went into reverse unexpectedly. The owner of Transmarine told the Marine Board that in a 1988 sea trial, the Alaska Ranger had gone astern about 15 seconds after personnel shut off the hydraulic pumps while a vessel was traveling ahead. From the U.S. Coast Guard, this occurred on at least one occasion in May of 1996, when the Alaska Ranger lost electrical power while at the dock with the main engines running. With the loss of electricity, the CPP system went from 0 pitch to negative pitch, and the vessel went astern and collided with the Alaska Warrior, which was moored just aft. And from the NTSB, what appears to be an additional incident. About 5 years before the sinking, the Alaska Ranger had run into a vessel behind it at the dock after its propellers had gone from neutral to a stern pitch while the engines were running. The FCA port engineer told the Marine Board that the incident occurred because the chief engineer had failed to engage the hydraulic pumps before starting the main engine. The Coast Guard stating, another means to prevent the astern motion caused by loss of hydraulic pressure was to shut the main engines down. While the pilot house console had these remote main engine emergency shutdown switches, the normal practice on board was for the engine room personnel to stop the engines. The pilot house remote main engine emergency shutdowns were serviced and tested in January of 2008. The tests were observed by the previous captain and the night engineer, but the captain and mate were not present. Despite having participated in the testing of the remote emergency shutdowns, both the day and night engineers testified the main engines could not be stopped from the pilot house, and only personnel in the engine room could shut them down. Based on testimony, the captain was surprised when the vessel went astern just prior to the sinking. At that time, it was probably no longer safe to enter the engine room, and the only way to stop the engines was by using the remote main emergency shutdowns, and that there was no warning or instructions alerting officers or crew members to the possibility that the vessel might go astern, nor were there written procedures or instructions on handling the situation. And I find this extremely frustrating. Anyway, a few key items from the NTSB's findings. Number 4. The Alaska Ranger would not have traveled astern if the vessel's controllable pitch propeller system had been equipped, as it originally was, with hydraulic pumps driven off the main propulsion shafts. Number 6. Slowing or stopping the main engines would have arrested the vessel's astern motion, which might have slowed the flooding, as well as prevented the life rafts from deploying out of reach. Number 7. There is no evidence that the Fishmaster compromised the Alaska Ranger Master's ability to exercise his command authority. Number 8. FCA personnel were under the mistaken impression that the Alaska Ranger had been strengthened for operation in ice. Number 10. During the Alaska Ranger's January 2008 dockside examination, the Coast Guard failed to identify that the vessel's engineers were not properly certificated. Number 11. FCA failed to effectively implement and enforce its drug and alcohol policy. Number 12. Under the circumstances of being occupied with rescuing survivors and treating them for hypothermia, it was reasonable that personnel on board the rescue vessels did not conduct post-accident testing for alcohol. Number 13. Post-accident drug testing requirements could have been met presumably later on board the Alaska Warrior or in Dutch Harbor, but they were not. Number 14. Although toxicology testing of specimens from the ship's master, mate, and chief engineer showed no evidence of alcohol or drug use, no conclusions can be reached regarding alcohol or drug use by surviving crew members because post-accident testing was not conducted. Number 15. A communication error delayed the discovery that the Fishmaster was missing. Number 16. The Coast Guard search and rescue effort, carried out under adverse weather and sea conditions, was timely and effective and minimized the loss of life in the accident. Number 17. The Coast Guard's seasonal basing of a rescue helicopter near the fishing grounds aided the rescue effort. Number 18. The dry dock examination of the Alaska Ranger performed as part of the AXA program was inadequate because not all hull areas specified in the program guidance were gauged. Number 19. Although the Coast Guard's initial implementation of the AXA program was flawed, the program has provided a higher level of safety for the enrolled commercial fishing industry vessels than existed previously. Number 20. The Coast Guard's ability to address safety deficiencies in commercial fishing industry vessels is limited by its lack of statutory inspection authority. Number 21. By imposing a regulatory bar against replacing Amendment 80 vessels, the regulations that implement the Fishery Management Plan for groundfish of the Bering Sea Aleutian Island Management Area negatively affect safety by preventing vessel owners from replacing aging vessels that pose increased operating risks. It should also be pointed out, the Coast Guard's report offers a quite impactful assessment regarding, quote, alcohol use and substandard watchkeeping. Despite FCA's no-tolerance policy, some crew members consumed alcohol aboard the vessel while at sea. Although the Marine Board did not find evidence that he was under the influence of alcohol the night of the incident, other crew members had observed the night engineer under the influence of alcohol while on watch. In addition, the night engineer was known to sleep while on duty. Evidence and testimony indicates various crew members had observed him asleep in the galley or engine room at night while on watch. A video taken by other crew members as part of a prank shows the night engineer sleeping in the engine room beside the previous engineer, who was also asleep, while the vessel was underway in December of 2007. One factory worker described an incident where an alarm registered on the flow scale in the factory, and he went to the engine room seeking assistance from the night engineer and found him asleep with an alarm light flashing in his face. From the NTSB report, according to a vessel survey conducted in July 2006, the estimated market value of the Alaska Ranger was $5.5 million, and the estimated replacement cost was $15 million. From what I can find, there was never any attempt at salvage or remote observation of the wreckage. From the NTSB's recommendations, to the U.S. Coast Guard, conduct refresher training for your marine inspectors and commercial fishing vessel examiners on the licensing and manning regulations that apply to commercial fishing industry vessels. Seek legislative authority to require that all commercial fishing vessels be inspected and certificated by the Coast Guard to ensure that the vessels provide an appropriate level of safety to those on board. To the National Marine Fisheries Service and North Pacific Fishery Management Council, amend regulations and fishery management plans for groundfish of the Bering Sea Aleutian Island Management Area to allow for replacement of an Amendment 80 vessel in situations other than vessel loss. The Fishing Company of Alaska, review and modify as necessary the procedures for enforcing your drug and alcohol policy to ensure full crew compliance. The story of FCA itself became a well-known cautionary tale in the industry, for some anyway. Illegal fishing activity on NOAA's radar, costing them hundreds of thousands in fines. Coast Guard reports of altercations on board FCA vessels between U.S. and Japanese crew members. The loss of the Alaska Juris in 2016 due to a lack of watertight integrity that again led to flooding of an engine room. The list goes on. FCA reportedly ended operations and sold off their remaining assets by early 2017. This video's gotten rather long, and although this story took some dark turns, I'd like to end on a somewhat uplifting note about so many who persevered and came together against all odds to try and ensure the safety of their fellow human beings. From the United States Coast Guard. Throughout the emergency and rescue efforts, many people aboard the Alaska Ranger awakened shipmates, helped others don immersion suits, provided encouragement, and assisted each other with entry into life rafts and survival in the water. The exceptional performance of the officers and crew of the Alaska Warrior, the first ship to arrive on scene, the USCG helicopter crews, and CGC Monroe personnel were all vital to the rescue of the 42 survivors. This channel's high standards for quality is made possible by the Immortar supporters, and a special thanks goes out to the top-tier Patreon supporters: Trayson, Sasha S., Sable, Rusty G., Robert G., Peyton, P. Rush, Paul Rohrbaugh, Nick C., Nathan M., Melon Lord, Maximum Hats, Mark W., Manuel M., Kyle W., Kenneth P., Justin S., Joshua S., David M., Cody H., Christian T., Broken Spectrum, Brendan C., Andrew M., and Alex S. And don't forget, your safety matters.